Hi, this is Louis Villa. I'm one of the co-founders of TideLift and our hosts, and I'm going to be your host for today's very first Upstream webinar titled Supporting the Python Community by Shifting Left. I'm excited to be joined today by our speaker, Kevin Fleming of Bloomberg. I'll give you a brief introduction to Kevin's long career. I always hate doing these because you're like, how do you select all the most important parts when somebody's been doing something for 30 years? He's worked with every major programming language and the gamut from modern open source messaging and networking all the way to mainframes. I'm sure Kevin's now going to wag his finger at me and say, but actually, those are deeply related. His primary skill is producing solutions that use resources effectively through problem analysis and solution design, right? The sort of big picture stuff that we all like to think about, but sometimes it's hard to get the time or the resources to do that. Kevin's been working particularly in open source for a long time and has been doing open source and open technology at Bloomberg in New York City since late 2012. His responsibilities include Bloomberg's collaboration with the open source community and ensuring that Bloomberg's engineers around the globe, which are, Kevin, you'll have to fill us in during the talk. I seem to remember the first time I heard exactly how many engineers there are at Bloomberg. I think of it as a news junkie. I think of it as a news organization, but of course it's very much also an engineering driven culture. And yep. As we're going to hear today, open source plays a really important part in that. We're planning to keep this webinar pretty casual today. Please, audience, feel free to submit any questions you have for Kevin by clicking on that Q&A button below, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Without further delay, Kevin.
Thank you, Louis. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides here. This will be brief as well. So hello, everyone. We published a blog post about this a couple of months ago, but this was a great opportunity provided to us by the Upstream team to have an interactive conversation about this and really explore the space a little bit more. So I'm really happy to be able to do this. I'm just going to guess that everybody on this call isn't going to be surprised by what's on this diagram. This has been the software development lifecycle for most software development for even longer than I've been doing software development, at least in most places. And so obviously you figure out what it is you want to build, you do some building, you do some testing and improvement, you deliver something, and then obviously you have to maintain and support it after that. That's been the case forever in very broad strokes. However, what's really changed in recent history, and you can debate whether this is the last 10 years or the last 20 years, but is that the development part isn't what it used to be. Way back in the day, in the mainframe days, for example, as Louis mentioned, development meant all of the development was done inside the company that was building the software. It was all people that they had hired to do the work, and that was that. And then things started to change. You brought in software from vendors. And of course, now in the world of open source, development really means picking and choosing which pieces of open source software you want to start to use to build your solution, and then wrapping them together and building all of your own special sauce around that. So that means that this chart is now misleading. It isn't just one task that happens in between defining scope and stabilization. It's development and integration and lots of different things along those lines. So great. Oops, did I do that right? I hit too many buttons. So there's a couple of different ways that could happen. Of course, you could be buying software from a vendor, buying licensing, whichever term you want to use. Louis is a lawyer, we'll say licensing because it's not buying. And so you're getting software from a vendor. It's probably proprietary software, but they're making it available for you to use inside your product under some sorts of terms that you negotiate with them, and presumably some money changes hands for that purpose. And you combine that with your own software, and great, okay. Well, now you're in a situation where determining when your software is stable and whether it's, let's say, sufficient quality to be released is now a joint effort between you and the vendor or vendors that are providing you software that you're including into your product. And presumably whatever contract you have in place, that the license agreement under which you got the software makes provisions for that, right? You've got some kind of support channel you can use, and they are under some sort of obligation to correct bugs and maybe even add new features when you need them and things like that. That's also a very traditional model for doing these kinds of things. You have a very tight relationship between you as the company making the product and the vendor that's providing components that go into your product. So again, we're familiar with that too. But we have this world now where not all the software you use, and many people will tell you probably more than likely most of the software you use isn't either of those. It's not internally developed, and it's also not vendor provided in the sense that they didn't write it and they don't own it. We have another model, which is somewhat common, but not terribly common, where you use a vendor who picks and chooses software from third parties, from whatever places those might have come, and does some kind of vetting on it, right? They make sure that their releases are stable. They take a little bit of responsibility for correcting bugs, maybe even backporting bug fixes from later releases when you don't want to upgrade to a newer release, and various those kinds of things. And so they're accepting some level of the responsibility of the quality of the things that they're giving you to incorporate into your product, but not all of it, because they didn't actually write it. So if there was a really serious flaw, or let's say, for example, some software you use and maybe you're delivering a product that runs on Apple's mobile devices, and the library that you've gotten isn't compatible with the brand new release of iOS that Apple just released. Your curation vendor is not going to be able to correct that problem for you. They didn't write the software. They're going to have to work with whoever did write the software to do that. But at least that's a responsibility you can delegate to them. They can go manage all of that and eventually come back to you and say, great, we have a version that works on the latest version of iOS, here you go. So that's another option that some companies can choose to do this. But of course, the real topic and why we're all here today is that almost every substantial software product today contains a lot of what we're going to call community provided software. It doesn't come from a vendor. It comes from some development community, probably some sort of community on the internet of people who may not have ever even met each other in person, who have decided to produce a piece of software, possibly a very complex piece of software, and make it available for everyone to use under some sort of open source software license. This is why we're here. This is why we do these things. We enjoy participating in communities like that. But of course, one of the things you give up when you choose to do that is you don't have anybody to contractually fix bugs for you anymore, or improve to make it work on a new version of an operating system, or things like that. When you choose to go in this direction, you're taking some of that burden on yourself now to choose which versions you're going to use, when there are bugs in them, to track them down. Of course, you have the source code, so you can track down the bugs, you can make improvements to them, and you can contribute them back. That's the world of enterprise software development that's consuming open source, and we're familiar with that. Where we begin to run into, I won't say problems, but concern areas is, okay, so maybe as an enterprise consumer of open source software, you would like to see the people that are producing that software maintain long-term release branches. Let's say, for example, not just always produce the latest and greatest version, but also maintain a long-term release branch so that you can stay on an older release and only get hand-selected bug fixes. You could ask for that, and they'll probably say, wow, that's a great idea. We don't have the resources to do that. We're a bunch of volunteer developers. We just don't have the resources to do that kind of thing. So you have to decide where these things land in your requirements, in your area of responsibility. There are a bunch of communities from which we source open source software. This is not all of them, but this is a bunch of them. And so we collaborate with all of these communities to try to do what we can to help, to make sure that we're not alone in having some of these desires. I won't say they're requirements. We can use the software without any of these changes being made, but there are certainly things we would desire to have. And so we participate in these communities in every way that we can to try to find ways to make the software something that meets our requirements more fully, but is also still the kind of thing the community wants to produce. We're not going to ask them to produce something different than what they currently produce, because that's not what they're in it for. They're in it to make the thing that they wanted to make. And when they want to make something else, they're going to make something else. So we are very tightly aligned with all of these organizations and a whole bunch more, talking to them all the time. And in many cases, we're actually, as you can see by logos, we're actually sponsors and members of these organizations because we want to have a way to be able to participate in their conversations about where their project is going in the future and what their roadmap for their software looks like and things like that. So what can we actually do, right? Obviously, we can just give people money, and that's sort of the last thing on the slide here, and I put it there on purpose because money isn't always the solution to the problem, right? There, you can talk to a group of people that are producing a piece of open source software that you really love to use and say, well, if I just gave you $250,000 a year, what would you be able to do with it? And they say, we don't actually know. We don't have any way to do anything with that money. We're not organized in a way that we could actually do that. For example, we can't hire developers. Maybe it's just a collective of volunteers and they can't hire anyone. So there's no way for them to make use of money like that. So it's really not the first place to look. It is an important place to look, but it's not the first place to look. The first place to look is you should be a contributor, right? You should, if you're going to consume software, you should be willing and able and interested in contributing back to it in whatever form that might be. Could be code, documentation, testing, answering questions on mailing lists, participating in webinars where people are asking questions about how to use the software. There's tons of ways to contribute to open source software projects. And so we encourage all of our engineering team members who are using open source software to do exactly that. Find ways to use your time and energy and passion to contribute back to those. As you become a more knowledgeable and active and I guess in some cases a respected contributor in that community, you'll probably be offered the opportunity to move up a level, and maybe you get to be what they call a committer, or maybe you get to be involved in the planning board or governance committee or whatever that community has that helps to decide where the project is going to go in the future, when the next release is going to be made and what features are going to be included in them. And when someone proposes a large contribution that might fundamentally change part of the product, you get to be a participant in deciding whether that actually goes in, or maybe it does not, because maybe it doesn't fit the vision for the product, or for the project, I should say. Of course, we like our people to get to that place too, but that's an organic thing, right? You don't buy those places. You become selected by the community as a member of their group to participate in those kinds of things. And then as a company, of course, we have resources that other company or the open source projects may not have. It might just need a bunch of cloud computing to be able to run continuous integration and testing and make sure their software is good. They might need places to store releases and databases that they use for testing and all those kinds of things. Those are things we can more easily provide because, of course, we can buy those things and give them to projects to use. So these are all ways that companies already do, but can think about supporting the communities that produce the software that they use. And so the thing you have to then think about is, what can you do? Well, the way you find out what you can do is you have to talk to them. You have to find out what it is that they need. And sometimes they don't know what they need. Sometimes they need someone to start the conversation so that they can figure out what they need, because it's not something that they sit down in planning meetings and talk about once a week like we do inside big companies where we have these kinds of meetings all the time. So don't just sit out on the sidelines and go post on Reddit and say, gosh, it would be really great if this project could do this better or could do that better. Go ask them, what could you do to help? What would be helpful? What would they find useful? And in some cases, they can't even tell you. They're going to need you as one of the community members to sort of watch and find out. Does it turn out that every time there's a new release of the software, there's a flurry of issues open in the GitHub repository because it had changes in the way that it worked and people weren't prepared for it? Well, if that's happening all the time in the project, you could begin a discussion and say, maybe you need to have long-term stable releases where these behavioral changes don't happen, and then users can choose when they want to upgrade to the next major release. And the community members might say, yeah, you're right, but we're going to need a maintainer to maintain that long-term release. Are you volunteering? Maybe you are volunteering. These are the kinds of discussions you can have with these communities to find out what it is that they really could benefit from, even though they may not know that they're benefiting from that. So we try to have these conversations with our communities, the communities we rely on all the time. And so one of the discussions we had recently, which prompted the blog post and these. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing that. This content being produced was we're trying to find ways that we could more fully participate in the packaging and delivery of Python software. Everything that's deployed, from the common Python package repositories. There are lots of open projects already going on. The Python Software Foundation is running some of them, and some of them are being run by others. And there's lots of great work going on in incorporating things like, the possibility of doing package signing and attestation of integrity and all of these kinds of things. And we thought, okay, we're Bloomberg. We have lots of smart people who are involved in this community already. What can we do to help? So one of our team members, who's a very active member of the community, said, do you think we should just set up a conversation with the Python Software Foundation and find out what could we do to help? And I said, sure, let's do that. What could be the harm in doing that? So we did. We had a great meeting with a bunch of people from the Python Software Foundation and a bunch of people from our side. And we learned of a really amazing opportunity that they had only come up with just a week or two before, which was they were interested in possibly having a person, a full-time position, to just keep track of and kind of herd the cats, the metaphor we've all used in software development forever, to try to ensure that all of these efforts about improving packaging could be coordinated well, could make sense and fit together well, and the community would understand how they were all planning to be used and all of that. And so the PSF people said, we've been contemplating doing something like this. Is that something Bloomberg would be interested in funding if we made that opportunity available? You can probably guess what the answer was, since we're here. And so we chose to do that, and that's what got us to the place we're at today. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Lewis has another guest on this call who's going to take it over from here.
Well, I don't know about take it over, but yeah, we have a special surprise guest, Eva.
Hi, definitely contributing, not taking over.
And so, it seemed appropriate, since we were talking about the Python Software Foundation, to ask Eva to join in. She's the executive director of the Python Software Foundation, with all the fun, zany, challenging responsibilities that implies, right? Keeping the place in financial shape, but also having conversations with folks like Kevin. So, we thought it'd be great to have you come in and talk a little bit about how is this hiring process going that Kevin's been talking about, and where do you think that project is going to be going in the near future?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that intro, Lewis, and for having me. And Kevin, honestly, that quick presentation that you just gave, I'm going to put that on the PSF's website, because it really elevates so much more. Sponsorship and membership is one way that organizations can contribute, but the engagement can really take it to the next level, which I really think that this project is exactly what's happening here. So obviously, like Kevin said, thanks to Bloomberg's and Kevin's support, engagement, and financial support, the PSF did put out a call for resumes for what we're calling the role as packaging project manager. We call it PPM for short. And that was about mid-April of this year, right before PyCon. And the packaging project manager job post received dozens of resumes in about a span of a month, which was really exciting. And in between then and now, we've kind of been working behind the scenes. We spent lots of time interviewing people and discussing candidates with stakeholders, such as our packaging work group members. And I'm really, really excited to announce for the first time that we've selected a candidate, and her name is Shamika Mohanan. And she actually just started this past Monday, August 1st. So the timing of this, like I said earlier, when we were planning, the timing of this upstream webinar couldn't be better. And I do want to point out that the PSF's Director of Infrastructure, E, has done a stellar job with the process by keeping it moving and getting key stakeholders involved, because it really does take a whole community to make this stuff happen. E will be publishing a full announcement of the role and the work that's going to be done in about a week. So everyone here gets a little bit of a sneak peek of what's to come. So that's really exciting. Yep. In terms of
that's very exciting.
Yeah, it is. In terms of, where this role is going to be going, there are definitely a few immediate goals that Shamika will have, but at a very high level, It will all stem around, community and corporate engagement to help the PSF and the PSF's packaging work group really get a better understanding of what kind of existing needs are out there for us to continue to fundraise for, what kind of resources are out there. So we're not, redoing the wheel every time, and then documenting it all. So we really have a better centralized location for all of this information. And then from there, we'll be working on fundraising as necessary for addressing these priorities that we come up with, right? Because sometimes we don't hear from all of the users that are encountering issues, just maybe the people that have access to talking to us. So, surveying our community is definitely going to be a top priority. And then recruitment of contractors and, of course, managing the work through completion is going to take the majority of the time. Needless to say, I think that this is a huge step forward for Python's packaging ecosystem, and I'm really excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the challenge of these sorts of things for nonprofits like PSF is, who are our stakeholders? How do we find them? Because so many of those stakeholders are often passive, right? So I'm sure that's one of the things you all are thinking about, is how do we build those communications channels and try to understand, well, who is it that we're serving with this thing anyway,
Exactly.
right? Because so many users of the package infrastructure are just sort of like, well, it's just there, right?
People that are not going to leave you comments on GitHub or reply to your mailing list threads. So yeah, definitely making sure that we get outreach out to everyone is going to be a key component here.
Well, that leads into one of the questions that I definitely wanted to ask both of you about this, which is, it seems like you've got a pretty clear vision for how do we improve, or at least how do we learn what we need to do to improve that core packaging infrastructure. But then, of course, there's this very complementary piece of the people who actually do the packaging, right? So, for example, if you do a package signing infrastructure, as Kevin has mentioned, well, then lots of package maintainers need to learn that new infrastructure. They probably need to generate new signing keys, things like that. Have you given much thought yet to how you're going to do that kind of outreach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of that refers to PEP 458 and 480, I believe, which are the Python enhancement proposals within our community. So a lot of this work has been taken on by NYU Secure System Labs, as well as several contractors that we've been working with, and of course, many, many volunteers. And of course, when I say volunteers, I mean maintainers, packagers, and also, people that just want to make sure that the thorough discussions happen about these topics before implementations actually happen. So I know Kevin was part of those discussions on our discourse. So I'm happy that all of that has taken part. And funding and availability of all of those involved are really two large hurdles, if you think about it, right? Because all of that has to be aligned in order for progress to happen. But I'm not sure if this has been publicly noted much, but recently the NYU group received a grant from NSF to continue working on this over the next 2 years. So I do think that a lot of that work is going to involve that outreach and coordination to make sure that it's successful. But at this point in time, we don't have any concrete plans, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big, didn't necessarily expect concrete plans, because that is a huge and challenging, I think maybe something that not a lot of, I'm struggling to think it, maybe Kevin, I know you have a broad view into a lot of communities. Have you seen any models of like really great outreach to entire packaging ecosystems to introduce new kinds of technologies like that? Because I know I can't think of any.
I can't say that I have, but you're absolutely right that that's the sort of thing that's necessary. There's the technical aspect of building signing infrastructure that the security people will sign off on as being something that you can trust.
Yeah.
But there's the entire other side, the user experience side, let's call it, if you want to, of okay, if you make the process so difficult that someone who just wants to publish a package for the first time has to spend an extra hour, doing that with tools they've never seen or heard of before, you're going to reduce the number of people that publish packages, and that's an overall harm to the ecosystem. So I can say this, and I do not mean to be disrespectful to any community, but I've been doing this sort of thing for a long time. I'm completely familiar with, for example, how GPG keys are generated and how key servers work and all of that. And yet, when I helped one of our teams publish our first Java package on Maven Central, it took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of trial and error to get everything to work correctly. So from a user experience point of view, that was bad. The end result is good. The package can be trusted. People who download it can validate that it was published by us and that it hadn't been tampered with, and that's all great. But as a developer, that was terrible. So that means that the thought processes that go into this have to say, okay, we can't make that sort of model the thing that we put developers through.
Right.
We can't do that. We have to have something that meets the bar of what the security people will accept, but also doesn't put so much of a burden in front of people that they can't do the things that they want to do. And so being able to provide funding and have a person who can think about these things to say, let's make sure every person at the table has a voice, not just the arcane math geeks who want the keys to be 4,000 bits long. That's fine. We also need to understand that it can't take you an hour or, heaven forbid, 2 weeks to publish your first package. That's not acceptable.
Right. But then on the flip side, you do have to, as you were saying, there's this challenge of, okay, but it's actually, the process has actually got to work, right? I mean,
Yes, right.
I spend a lot of time fighting with metadata about licensing, right? Where we've and this is not a Python specific thing, many package managers have what I would call not great quality of package management information, of license management information, in part because we've built a system that assumes that every developer is also a legal expert and now a security expert. And and it's, and of course, many actually are, right? I don't mean to demean this. There are, in fact, very sophisticated thinkers about licenses in some of these communities. But when you spread it out over the long tail of packages, sometimes that quality ends up slipping a little bit at the tail end, right? And how you improve that over time from people who were well-intentioned in what they were doing at the beginning, but then the world has sort of caught up and started saying things like, well, actually, this is not good enough, right? We need more detail, more nuance. And that's a really tough, I asked that question because if anybody in the audience knows about any role models that we should all be learning from, because it's a very, this is one of these things where open source, and Eva, you've been, especially in your position at PSF, I'm sure you've got a lot of interesting examples of the success being a very two-edged sword, right? Where we
Absolutely.
simultaneously, it was, the popularity is amazing and important, and we wouldn't ever want to stop that, but also, sometimes we've got new people on board who need a lot of education and training, and we haven't always kept up. I think one of the things that's exciting about this shift left thinking from Kevin is that it represents some, instead of just fixing what comes out at the end, actually trying to move and get things on the left side of the pipeline, right?
And I guess maybe this could be a call to action for everyone that's watching and listening is, when you see these kinds of announcements and surveys going out, take the time to share it with your networks or with your groups, just because it really is a community effort to make sure that this is successful.
Well, so that actually leads directly to a question that I really wanted to ask. What kinds of things can people and communities do to make these kinds of initiatives either make their community a sort of better prepared if an opportunity like this comes up, or once it does come up, what can they do to help it succeed?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, at the PSF, we have several communication channels that we use, and we try to always duplicate information across them. So it depends on the person's preference, but Twitter is a great way. At the PSF, we make sure that and also at PyPI, those are both great channels to stay tuned to, as well as the PSF's blog. which we always publish. Any large announcements, especially like when we did the pip revolver and all that work, that was always publicized through our blog. And I guess the last part that's really great to stay tuned to would be the PSF's newsletter, which goes out every other month. And we're always short if there is any PyPI or PyPA updates that we include them in the newsletter. So, just keeping up with the news that we throw at you, that's the best way.
Yeah,
and how do you go ahead, Kevin.
This is probably true in other package language ecosystems as well, but the Python ecosystem is probably a model for having hundreds, if not thousands, of user groups all around the world that have their own communications channels and regular meetings and all of those kinds of things. So if you are a person who's interested in this kind of topic and you are a participant in your local user group, be the advocate. Go there and get that discussion started in that group so that the other 50, 100, 200 people that are part of your local user group who might not have read the blog post or may not have seen the tweet or whatever can at least be aware that this is a discussion and that the survey's out or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great point.
In this community, at least, we have a very broad reach, but it's many levels. It's not 50 million people following the same Twitter handle. It's this many leveled branching discussion or dissemination method. So use it. It's there, and there's a reason for it to be there. So they could use that too.
Also, regional conferences. I'll add to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
See, this just shows that Kevin is a great community member.
Right. I mean, it is hard to, Kevin, I mean, one of the things that I admire about the stuff you've done, it's hard as a corporate contributor to really stay deeply in touch in that way, right? Like even when you're well-intentioned, your day job or responsibilities to other platforms or whatever can really get in the way.
Sure.
So that's impressive that you still got your pulse on that.
Well, that was a portion of the subject of the session I did earlier today with my compatriot Alyssa, who's also on here. That this actually needs to be part of a company's OSPO's responsibilities. You need to be staying engaged with your communities. If you're not, if you stop paying attention for 2 months or 3 months, you're going to miss important changes, and then you've got your own form of technical debt to try to pay off. It's not engineering debt, but it's a different kind. So it's sort of like being a really productive and effective software developer means some percentage of your time you're always reading, you're always learning new techniques, you're always learning new programming languages, you're always learning new things, because if you don't, you get left behind by the rapid pace of change in the industry that you're in. Is probably true in the attorney space as well, I would guess. So it's true for community management and collaboration as well, that things are changing all the time, and if you aren't actively making sure that you're staying part of the conversation, you will become disconnected, a small amount, but then it gets more and more and more and more, and eventually you're like, I don't even recognize this community anymore. And there's nothing wrong with the community, it's just you became disconnected from it. So
right. Yeah, which is, can happen for both good and bad reasons, right?
Of course.
I mean, certainly
sure.
Where did you, for listeners who may be interested, with the earlier talk about OSPOs today, where was that?
That was the very first ever To-Do Group OSPology community meeting, which was 4 hours ago, something like that. Organized by the To-Do Group's brand new project manager. And so Alyssa and I presented and talked about the Bloomberg's open source program office and what's involved in creating an open source program office at a company and those sorts of things. So, and that of course got into what would be the expected responsibilities of a group of people doing that. And this is part of it, is you can't be a passive observer. You've got to be an active participant. If you're not, you aren't really getting the benefit that you should out of what you're trying to do. So.
Right. Well, that's a great, I mean, for those in the audience who are either part of an open source program office or are thinking about creating one at their company, the To-Do Group is a terrific resource. So highly recommend Googling that and getting involved. It should be pretty searchable for you. Eva, I wanted to talk about a little bit of the flip side of that, something that you've been, I would say, less mature open source foundations or community groups sometimes find it a little challenging or even intimidating to figure out how to work with OSPOs and with big companies. And PSF seems to have a pretty good track record there. And I was wondering if there's anything, especially as you look back on your time as ED, anything that you'd recommend to other groups, or that you're particularly proud of in how you've tried to build those kinds of corporate nonprofit relationships?
I think something that we did, well, because of the pandemic and how PyCon US is a large component of our revenues, we really rethought how we did our sponsorship for 2021 by putting a lot of things into our sponsorship buckets. And that included IPI, and that included, CPython support. And that really, when we went out to have conversations with our sponsors and our members this year, it was an overwhelming amount of discussions that we had, Kevin and Bloomberg being some of those discussions. And I think that really helped us know where, the OSPOs or whoever the contacts are, where they stand and how they are willing to support us. So just knowing that they're there. As soon as I got off the phone with Kevin and the Bloomberg team after our sponsorship call, I'm like, Kevin, we have this really good idea that we're thinking about. What do you think? And it just starts that conversation going and eventually leads to execution of it. So just really having that open communication with your sponsors and members to hear what they have to say, what are their needs, what do they feel you need to improve on. Asking all these questions is a great way to start.
Kevin, anything you'd add from the other side of that equation?
No, I think I would echo that we've had not just on the foundation sponsorship side, but we're also, or I should say, my area, we're also responsible for conference sponsorship. So in the Python land, that means we're both a PyCon sponsor and also a foundation sponsor. But in other cases, we might just be conference sponsors and things like that. And obviously, the pandemic has thrown all the balls up in the air, and nobody knows where they're going to come down. And it's had some really interesting effects and some unfortunate effects with, for example, the announcement today that the LISA conference is done. They're not doing it anymore, which is really sad. But again, it's we must have had half a dozen conversations with the Usenix people to say, what can we do to help? Obviously, there's only so much we can do as one participant, but we want to understand, what do you really need to be able to make sure you can stay around and you can stay productive and you can stay healthy, and we don't lose this channel that has existed for a while. And again, that's, if all you do is just enter a purchase order once a year to have a sponsorship bill paid, and then you never talk to the people on the other end of that, chances are they're not going to reach out to you either when they're exploring what could they do to address a really unusual problem like this, because you're not in their minds, right? They're just a check that comes in once a year, and that's great. They appreciate that, but there's no back and forth communication channel already established. So you need to have that so that it can be worked both directions.
Yeah.
I'm quoting this and tweeting it after we're all done here.
Yeah, I mean, I know that can be a really tough one for some folks, especially in organizations that don't have full-time staff yet, right? That's definitely a phase shift of your capability on that. And I've definitely been on the other side of the trying to hire the first person. That's a tough one. I want to shift back a little to a more technical aspect of this left shift, right? Because there is this question, Eva, as you mentioned, of what exactly are we asking people to do? What infrastructure are we building? And there have been a number of initiatives this year that have come out and tried to sort of answer that question for the industry, right? The many folks here will have heard of the federal government's work on software bills of materials, often abbreviated as SBOMs. And the Google has an initiative called SLSA, which I am forgetting I think one of the S's is security, but
supply chain, I think supply chain.
Right. Linux Foundation has a CII, the Common Infrastructure Initiative. There's a bunch which is a slightly older one, but has been maturing and growing over time. There's a bunch of these different initiatives that are trying to say, actually, the answer to the problem is X. And I'm wondering, for you two, is there anything in particular from this variety of initiatives that seems really promising? Anything you're particularly excited about? On the flip side, is there anything you've seen that is a little worrisome to you that you think might be biting off more than we can chew, or anything along those lines?
I mean, from the foundation standpoint, I guess I can say that, first of all, I'm really excited that all of these initiatives are happening. It's highlighting a lot of issues within open source. I don't like using the word issues. I tried thinking of something new and it didn't happen. But I think
I think it's okay, right? I think
yeah.
I think that's a real, like, these are challenges. They're not. We try to say.
Right.
We try to say at Tidelift, for what it's worth, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just think
No
this
worries.
is such a key. It's okay for us to say open source is imperfect. Open source is a work in progress, and it does have issues. It does have challenges. That pet peeve of mine. Sorry to interrupt.
No, please do. Makes me feel better. But as I'm sure a lot of you have seen recently, PyPI has been bearing the brunt of a lot of security issues recently. Researchers finding security holes and publishing them. So it's really great to see, especially, the SLSA, I believe that's the acronym. I know it's supply chain, but that's all I know. So it's really great to see that those kinds of things are being put forth. But I think it's too early to tell how that's going to impact, at least, for example, something like PyPI, right? Like you mentioned SBOMs, which the PSF's packaging work group did contribute to that, and they did do a write-up and submitted, which we have never done before, which is a huge step forward for us to contribute what we think about something like that, right? And how what we put, what kind of input we give is going to actually impact the course there. But I do think that, it kind of all goes back to kind of, Lewis, what you said, biting off more than you can chew. A lot of things, especially in the Python community, are blowing up, and the PSF is growing along with that growth, but I'm not sure, at what rate can that continue, right? It has to be sustainable. It has to be done effectively. Otherwise, it won't be successful. So yeah, I mean, our goal at the PSF is just to continue growing. Hiring that first person is a challenge. Continuing to hire and have that beautiful structure in place is also a challenge. So internally, that's definitely something we always keep in mind. So we have that structure in place to support these new implementations.
I mean, I think it's great, and very much, again, a credit to the whole PSF, including your leadership, Eva, that PSF was able to respond to that, to that call for. I mean, that was a very again, for those not familiar with it, the federal government put out a call for comments, essentially, and a company like Google has a team whose job it is to just pay attention to these kinds of things and put together proposals, polish and edit them. I'm sure Bloomberg's government relations folks have some of that capacity as well. I've been in communities that get caught by surprise by this kind of stuff, right? So it's even if it was the first one, I'm sure that was a little intimidating, but very much that you had the capacity to do that is really a great sign of the maturation of.
I just feel like it just falls. Everything seems to theme here around engagement. If you don't have that engagement and you're not participating in those discussions, then you're going to be left out of whatever happens afterwards. So
right. And there are active communities. I ran some similar processes at the Wikimedia Foundation, often responding to things like EU copyright law, for example, right? And it is simultaneously very fun and very frustrating to write that collaboratively, right? Like, it's not all of our collaborative processes are a little more optimized for code than they are for prose. So that's always an interesting challenge. Yeah, Kevin, what about you? Anything in particular about these things that jump out or you see as big challenges?
Well, I'm going to take the bait. I know you would go this direction anyway, but one of the things that we all have to keep in mind, it kind of goes back to the developer experience point of view, is, we don't want to get to the place, at least this is my opinion, I'm not even speaking on behalf of Bloomberg, this is me personally, but I'm certain that we do not want to get to the place where when a developer wants to upload a package to PyPI for the first time, they get asked a question, are you uploading this with the intention of companies and the government using it? If so, you have to do these 47 additional things before you can upload your package. We don't want to be in that place. On the other hand, there is a reasonable goal to say, but at least the license statement in your package should be well formed and accurate and represent what you wanted. And you should have an accurate list of what your dependencies are. Those are good things for the whole community. So finding that balance between what's sufficient for a developer to just make their code available for other people to use, and what's sufficient for an enterprise that's going to bundle it into a hardware appliance that they're going to sell 12 million copies of, those are way different bars, and the developer isn't responsible for the second one. So somehow we have to figure out how you get to from the first to the second without putting the burden on someone who that was never their intent in the first place. They didn't publish the code for that purpose. And so maybe they're willing to do it. That's great if they're. Maybe they're one of those people you mentioned who are just super geeks about absolutely everything, and they'll go through every little detail and they'll make their package an exemplar for the rest of the world. But that's 1 out of 10,000 at best that would do that. And the other 9,999 are going to have some help figuring out how you get to that place, and the community has to help them. So
right. And there's very much a version of this shift left dialogue that, we filed, I don't know if you saw this, Kevin, but we at TideLift filed a commentary for this government SBOM call for comments, and it was specifically about, look, the quality of the information is going to be the highest and most reliable the further upstream it gets sourced.
Right.
But yet at the same time, that does run into this challenge of, it's very much a burden. And how do you square those two? Because we know that creating the further downstream the metadata gets created, the more wonky and flaky, the harder that update cycle is. There was a time when I really enjoyed helping people out of those licensing holes, and and weirdly, Kevin, you've heard me say this before, I'm sure, that it was a weird time when I was at a law firm that I would get paid to fix those problems, but the developer who was actually doing the work, wasn't and actually had the knowledge, didn't get paid, which was always an odd thing, and something that we did try to convey in that SBOM thing. And we'll actually, by coincidence, have a post about that coming out in the next couple of days on opensource.com, probably. Great. We think it's a recurring theme, and interestingly, NTIA did actually pick up on that, right? Like I think it was to their credit that they mentioned incentives and how are we getting people aligned there? And that's going to be a challenge across the whole stack, right? Obviously, for those in the audience who are familiar with TideLift, we have our own take on this. That I won't turn this into a TideLift ad, but it's going to be a challenge at all of the levels, right? The big consumers like you are, Kevin, Eva, as this sort of intermediary. In many ways, PSF has really turned into what started, and I don't mean this as a criticism, what started as a very community-centric organization now in many ways serves as sort of an intermediary or meeting place between these communities. And I think that's a big challenge for the next wave of all of these organizations. And I know, Eva, you said publicly you're stepping aside and handing the baton off to somebody else. So it's going to be wonderful to see what they do. I think actually, any closing notes? I think that's a great closing note for us to be thinking about how we do the shift left. But anything you two want to add before we call today and say thank you to our audience?
No, I have nothing, but thank you so much for this wonderful discussion.
Yeah, ditto. I think this is, we need to have more of these discussions, and we're going to have to figure out what the right venues are. Some of our venues have sort of temporarily evaporated, so hopefully some of them will come back, and we'll have to continue doing these things and figure out what we can all do as a group, as a global community to make the situation better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for your initiative in this, and Kevin, and thank you, Eva, for providing this terrific path for it to happen. I wish the project luck, and good luck with the announcement. So, all right, thank you,
all.
everybody.